Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory, October 1888. The air was already sharp with the promise of a brutal winter, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed through the narrow settlement. But the work at Soren Lund's claim was different. It was drawing stares, then whispers, then open mockery. Soren, a quiet man of 40, with the broad shoulders of a craftsman, was not building one cabin. He was, to all appearances, building two. First, he had erected a small, sturdy-looking log structure, a complete cabin in its own right, but oddly undersized for a man with a wife and 2 children. Now he was methodically erecting a second, larger frame around the first, leaving a curious, uniform gap between the inner and outer walls. Briscoe Tate, a master framer who had built half the structures in the valley and whose opinion on timber was treated as gospel, stopped by on his way from the mill. He watched for a long moment, his face a mask of professional disbelief. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near a pile of shavings. "Soren!" he called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man rarely questioned. "What in God's name are you doing? You're building 2 weak cabins instead of 1 strong one." Soren Lund paused, sighting down a post before setting it. "I'm building 1 warm cabin, Briscoe," he said, his Danish accent softening the words. Tate shook his head, a wry grin on his face, as he turned to Rufus Nye, the local wagon maker, who had joined him. "He's wasting half his timber on air. It's a fool's errand. That gap will fill with mice, rot, and drafts. He'll have the coldest house in the valley." The judgment was passed. Within a day, the project had a name: Lund's Folly. The word crazy was used more than once. The mockery was good-natured, as frontier mockery often was, but it was absolute. Everyone knew how to build a cabin. You used the thickest logs you could find, joined them tight, and chinked them deep. You didn't build a wooden box and then put another bigger box around it. What did this quiet Danish shipwright, a man who knew more about keeping water out than keeping heat in, understand about the physics of dead air that a master framer with 2 decades of frontier experience had completely missed? If you want to understand the simple, powerful secret of thermal insulation that our ancestors knew, a secret that modern building science has only recently rediscovered, hit that subscribe button. I promise, by the end of this story, you'll look at the walls of your own home in a completely new way. We read every comment, so let us know where in the world you're watching from. The answer to Briscoe Tate's question wasn't found in the forests of Montana, but in the frigid, windswept shipyards of Esbjerg, Denmark. Soren Lund was not a cabin builder. He was a shipwright, apprenticed at 14 to a master who built fishing trawlers destined for the brutal waters of the North Atlantic. He didn't think in terms of walls. He thought in terms of hulls. He knew that a ship's greatest enemy, after a rogue wave, was the insidious, life-sapping cold that radiated from the sea. He had spent his youth learning how to seal a space, how to make a join not just strong, but impermeable. He knew that the most precious cargo a ship carried was the warmth of the men inside it. He understood that a thin layer of trapped, unmoving air between an inner and outer hull could mean the difference between a tolerable voyage and a fatal one. He had come to Montana in 1887 with his wife Thyra and their 2 small children, 8-year-old Axel and 6-year-old Freya. The promise was land, a piece of the world to call their own, away from the crowded ports of the old country. They had purchased a claim with a small, existing cabin, built in the standard frontier style, single-wall construction with 10-inch pine logs, mud and moss chinking, and a single stone fireplace. It looked sturdy. It looked like a home. Then their first winter arrived. It was a trial by freezing. The cabin, which had seemed so robust in the mild autumn, became a sieve for the cold. Soren watched with a craftsman's quiet fury as the home failed in every conceivable way. He would stoke the iron stove until it glowed cherry red, creating a 10-foot circle of oppressive heat, while just outside that circle, the temperature plummeted. Thyra would place a bucket of water for the morning just 6 feet from the stove. By dawn, it would be skinned with a half-inch of ice. Frost grew in crystalline ferns on the nail heads that pierced the roof boards. The family slept in coats and hats, buried under every blanket they owned. Little Freya was sick for a month with a deep, rattling cough. Axel's hands were perpetually raw and chapped. Soren watched his wife patiently, endlessly, stuffing scraps of wool and cloth into the ever-opening gaps in the chinking as the green logs shrank in the dry, frigid air. He had built vessels that kept men alive in the teeth of an Arctic gale, yet he lived in a house that couldn't hold warmth against a still Montana night. He made a quiet vow to himself, not with anger, but with the cold resolve of a man facing a technical problem. Never again. The failure of that first cabin was not due to poor workmanship. It was a failure of physics. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was built on a partial understanding of the problem. The settlers prized mass. A thick log wall felt strong, permanent, and secure. It could stop a bullet, a bear, or a blizzard's gale-force wind, but it could not, by its very nature, stop the silent, invisible transfer of heat. The attack came from 3 directions at once. The first was conduction. Heat is energy, and it naturally flows through solid objects from a warmer area to a colder one. A log, for all its thickness, is a solid object. The heat from the stove warmed the interior surface of the log wall, and that heat energy was conducted, molecule by molecule, straight through the wood to the frozen exterior, where it was lost to the outside world. A 12-inch pine log has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance of about 15. But this was a theoretical best-case scenario. Every knot, every crack, and especially the corners where logs were joined, created thermal bridges, superhighways, for heat to escape. The second enemy was convection. This was the enemy Soren knew best. Air, when heated, expands, becomes less dense, and rises. When it cools, it contracts, becomes denser, and sinks. Inside the cabin, a relentless cycle was at work. The stove heated the air, which rose to the ceiling. There, it made contact with the cold roof boards and the upper logs of the walls, instantly chilling it. This cold, heavy air then sank back to the floor, creating a constant, imperceptible, and sometimes very perceptible, draft. It was this convective loop that made the cabin floor so frigid that the children couldn't play on it. It was fed by every tiny gap in the building's envelope. Air whistled through cracks in the chinking, around the ill-fitting door, and through the sashes of the single-pane window. These weren't just drafts, they were open wounds, bleeding the precious heat of the cabin into the wilderness. The third, and perhaps most insidious enemy, was radiation. Every warm object, including a human body, radiates heat in the form of infrared energy. In a well-insulated room, the walls are close to the same temperature as the air, and they radiate heat back, creating a feeling of comfort. But in a standard log cabin, the interior surface of the walls was often only a few degrees warmer than the outside temperature. These cold walls acted like black holes for radiant energy, sucking the warmth directly from the bodies of the people inside. It was the reason a person could feel a chill on their back, even while their face was roasting by the fire. This was the shared, accepted misery of the frontier. Briscoe Tate, for all his skill, lived in a cabin that consumed 4 cords of wood a month during the deep winter. Rufus Nye, the wagon maker, had to bring his greases and oils inside each night to keep them from solidifying into useless blocks. Dorothea Kell, who ran the boarding house, had a regular winter ritual of apologizing to her guests for the ice in their water pitchers. They fought the cold with the only weapon they had, more fuel. They burned prodigious amounts of wood, clear-cutting the surrounding hillsides, just to stay one step ahead of hypothermia. They saw the cold as a beast to be battled, not a problem to be solved. Soren Lund saw it differently. He would not fight the beast. He would build a cage for the warmth. In the late summer of 1888, Soren dismantled the old cabin, saving every sound log and board. He expanded the stone foundation, making it wider and laying it with a precision that made Briscoe Tate nod in grudging approval. Then the strangeness began. He started with the inner cabin. It was small, just 18 by 22 feet on the inside, framed with the salvaged 6-inch logs. He didn't join them with the usual saddle notch. Instead, he used a complex joinery he had learned from shipbuilding, a sealed tongue and groove system that left almost no gap. He caulked every seam with a mixture of pine pitch and oakum, a tarred fiber used to make boat hulls watertight. To his fellow settlers, the walls looked too thin. Briscoe Tate made one of his regular inspection tours. "Soren, that cabin's too small for your family, and the logs are too thin. A real blizzard will push that right over." Soren wiped sweat from his brow, his blue eyes calm. "This is only the inside," he said. The statement made no sense. It hung in the air, baffling the onlookers. They watched as Soren completed the inner box, complete with a ceiling of tightly fitted planks. Then he began the outer structure. He erected sturdy posts at the corners and midpoints of the foundation, several inches away from the inner cabin. He ran beams across the top, creating a frame for a second, larger building that completely enveloped the first. As he began to sheath the outer frame, the design became clear. There was a perfect, uniform 4-inch space between the inner and outer walls, a void that ran uninterrupted around the entire perimeter of the house. Rufus Nye, the wagon maker, stopped by, shaking his head in genuine confusion. He was a practical man who understood the value of materials, and he saw waste. "You're using wood for 2 cabins to get the space of 1. You're spending double the money for half the room. That gap is just a home for mice and drafts, Soren. You'll never get it warm." Soren was carefully measuring the space between the 2 walls, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He turned to the wagon maker. "The air is the wall," he said, then returned to his work. The phrase became a local joke. "The air is the wall?" Men would say it at the trading post and chuckle. It summed up the perceived foolishness of the project. To them, air was the enemy. It was the draft, the wind, the cold itself. The idea of using it as a building material was absurd. Soren ignored them. He meticulously sheathed the outer frame, creating a solid exterior wall. He built a single, heavy door and 1 well-fitted window, but he constructed them as deep assemblies that passed through both walls, like portals. The jambs were 14 inches deep, 6 inches for the inner wall, 4 inches for the air gap, and another 4 inches for the outer sheathing. He insulated the space above the inner ceiling, between the 2 roof lines, packing it a foot deep with sawdust and wood shavings he got for free from the sawmill. But the crucial 4-inch gap in the walls, he left it entirely empty. It contained nothing but what Rufus Nye said it did: air. When the structure was complete, Thyra came out to look at it. She placed a hand on the remarkably thick wall next to the doorway. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling. The cabin didn't look like a log home anymore. It looked like a small fortress. "It looks like a wooden box inside a bigger wooden box," she said, her voice neutral. Soren came and stood beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. He looked at the finished work, then at the forest, then at the sky. He could smell the coming snow. "A warm box, he said. The physics behind Soren's Folly was both simple and profound. The problem, as he understood it, wasn't the wood. The problem was how heat moved. His design was a deliberate, systematic attack on all three forms of heat transfer. His primary target was conduction. By building two separate walls, he broke the solid bridge that heat would normally travel across. For warmth to escape his cabin, it first had to conduct through the 6-inch inner log wall. This was the first barrier. Then, it reached the 4-inch air gap. Air is a remarkably poor conductor of heat, hundreds of times less conductive than solid wood. The heat struggled to cross this empty space. If it succeeded, it then encountered the outer wall, another barrier it had to conduct through before finally escaping. He had replaced a single, easily traveled road for heat, with a difficult multi-stage journey with a massive roadblock in the middle. But simply having an air gap was not enough. Soren's deep understanding, born from his shipbuilding trade, was of the critical importance of stopping convection. If the air within the gap was allowed to move, it would become a heat engine in reverse. The air touching the warm inner wall would heat up, rise, travel to the top of the cavity, touch the cold outer wall, transfer its heat, and then sink back down to the bottom, ready to pick up more heat from the inner wall and start the cycle all over again. This convective loop would turn the air gap from an insulator into a radiator, actively pumping warmth out of the house. This is why his meticulous sealing was not for show. By carefully capping the wall cavity at the top and bottom plates and ensuring the walls themselves were airtight, Soren trapped the air. He created what building science now calls dead air. Since the air could not circulate, it could only transfer heat by the slow, inefficient process of conduction. This was the secret. The stillness of the air was everything. It was the same principle that gives a wool sweater its warmth. It's not the fibers themselves, but the millions of tiny pockets of trapped, still air between them that do the insulating. Finally, his design defeated radiation. Because the inner wall was so well insulated from the outside cold, its interior surface stayed much, much warmer than the wall of a conventional cabin. Instead of being a cold surface that leached radiant heat from his family's bodies, it became a warm surface that was close to the ambient temperature of the room. It radiated warmth back at them, creating a profound sense of comfort that had nothing to do with the air temperature alone. It was the difference between standing near a block of ice and standing near a warm stone. The numbers told the story. Briscoe Tate's magnificent 12-inch log walls had a theoretical R value of about 15. Soren's inner 6-inch wall was about R 7.5, and his outer wall was about R 4 since it was framed sheathing, not solid log. But the 4-inch gap of still dead air between them added an R value of nearly R 4 by itself. His total wall system had a calculated R value of over R 15, slightly better than Tate's. But this calculation missed the real genius. By eliminating almost all air infiltration, drafts, and thermal bridging, Soren's cabin performed as if it had an R value of R 25 or higher. It was a system where the whole was far greater than the sum of its parts. It was, in effect, a 60% improvement in thermal performance achieved with a design that everyone else had dismissed as madness. That winter, the winter of 1888 to 89, came in like a hammer. It would be remembered across the territory as the Great White Siege. The snows started in early November and did not stop. By January, a cold, dry Arctic air mass settled over the mountains and refused to leave. For 2 weeks straight, the temperature at the settlement never rose above zero, and at night it plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes colder. It was the kind of cold that found every weakness, that tested every structure and every living thing to its breaking point. For the residents of the Bitterroot Valley, it was a time of grim survival. At Briscoe Tate's cabin, considered one of the best built in the region, the fight was constant. The extreme cold shrank the logs further, and the chinking, now frozen solid as rock, cracked and pulled away. Tate spent his days re-stuffing the gaps, his breath freezing in clouds around him. They burned through 5 cords of wood in the month of January alone. The family abandoned the upstairs loft and lived entirely in the main room, huddled in a tight circle around the roaring stove. The story was the same across the settlement. Rufus Nye's wife came down with a severe case of pneumonia. Her illness worsened by the inescapable chill in their home. At Dorothea Kell's boarding house, the situation was dire. She had to close the entire upper floor after the water in the washstand pitchers froze solid, cracking the thick ceramic. Her guests slept in their coats, and her fuel bills were ruinous. The accepted misery of winter had become an active, life-threatening siege. But at Lund's Folly, a different reality was unfolding. Inside the cabin within a cabin, there was peace. Soren kept his small, efficient stove burning low and steady. With a single load of wood, he could easily maintain a stable temperature of 65 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the entire space. There were no cold spots, no drafts. Thyra baked bread on a table near the wall, and the dough rose perfectly. The children, Axel and Freya, played on the wooden floor in their woolen socks, their laughter echoing in the warm, still air. The most telling evidence was the morning routine. Soren would bank the fire with ash before bed around 10 o'clock. When the family woke at 6 the next morning, even after a night of minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures outside, the cabin would still be 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire was easy to restart from the hot coals. The water bucket in the corner never even formed a skin of ice. While his neighbors were waging a desperate hour-by-hour battle for warmth, Soren Lund's family was simply living. He used just over 1 cord of wood for the entire brutal month of January. The contrast was not just visible, it was quantifiable, and the numbers were staggering. Winter had stopped being a siege and had become simply weather. The breaking point for Briscoe Tate came on the coldest night of the year. The thermometer outside the general store read minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Inside his own home, despite a roaring fire, the walls radiated a palpable cold, and his children were shivering under a mountain of blankets. His pride, a formidable structure in its own right, finally cracked under the weight of his family's misery. He bundled himself in 3 layers of wool and walked the 100 yards through the deep, squeaking snow to Soren Lund's place. He saw the single plume of smoke rising from Soren's chimney. It was thin and lazy, not the thick, panicked column of smoke belching from his own chimney. He knocked on the heavy door. When Soren opened it, the first thing that struck Tate was not a blast of heat, but a wave of stable, gentle warmth. It wasn't the scorching, temporary heat of an overstoked fire. It was the deep, pervasive warmth of a place that was inherently warm, not just momentarily heated. He stepped inside, and the absence of drafts was shocking. He took off his hat and gloves, his fingers numb. Soren closed the door, and the silence of the insulated home settled around them. Tate's eyes took in the scene. Thyra knitting peacefully in a chair, the children playing quietly with wooden blocks on the floor. He walked over to the wall, the very wall he had ridiculed, and placed his bare hand on the inner logs. They were cool to the touch, but not cold. They felt like a piece of furniture, like room-temperature wood, not a slab of ice-bleeding heat from the world. His gaze went to Soren's small, neatly stacked wood pile by the stove. It was a fraction of the size of the mountain of wood he had already burned through that week. The evidence was overwhelming. a complete sensory refutation of his own deeply held expertise. He was a master framer, a man whose identity was tied to his knowledge of wood and construction, and he had been completely, utterly wrong. He turned to the quiet Dane. His voice was low, stripped of its usual authority. "Soren," he said, "you were right. I was wrong." He looked back at the wall. The air is the wall. Soren Lund, a man who valued results over words, simply gave a slight nod. He had no need for apology or triumph. The proof was the warmth in the room, the comfort of his family. "Would you like some coffee, Briscoe?" he asked. The conversion of Briscoe Tate was the turning point. When the Valley's foremost expert admitted his error, the mockery ceased, replaced by a current of intense curiosity. Rufus Nye came next, not with jokes, but with genuine questions. Others followed. They didn't come to apologize for their ridicule. That wasn't the frontier way. They came for knowledge. They would stand in the middle of Soren's warm living space, running their hands over the walls, asking quiet, technical questions. How did you seal the top plate to stop the draft? What about moisture in the gap? Did you use green wood or seasoned for the outer frame? Soren, in his patient, minimalist way, answered every question, sharing his knowledge as freely as he would share a cup of coffee. He never once said, "I told you so." He didn't have to. The cabin said it for him. That spring, after the Great White Siege finally broke, the Lund double wall became a local phenomenon. Briscoe Tate, the former chief skeptic, became its most passionate and credible advocate. He didn't just adopt the idea, he refined it. He developed a method for retrofitting existing cabins, building a secondary frame around them, and creating what he called an air jacket. He helped 3 families air jacket their homes before the next winter, transforming their drafty shelters into warm, efficient dwellings. He would explain the principle to anyone who would listen, using Soren's exact words. "You see, the air is the wall, but it has to be still." Rufus Nye, the pragmatic wagon maker, adapted the design for his workshop. By building a simple inner wall of rough-sawn planks inside his existing shop, he created a workspace that was usable through the winter for the first time in his career, dramatically increasing his productivity and income. By the autumn of 1889, in 7 new homesteads in the valley were being built using the double wall method. The initial cost was about 20% higher in materials and labor, a significant sum for cash-strapped settlers. But the return on investment was staggering, a documented savings of over 60% in firewood, year after year. On the frontier, that was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of solvency and survival. The math was undeniable. The Folly had become the standard. Word of the warm cabins in the Bitterroot Valley eventually traveled. A writer for the Montana Husbandman, a regional agricultural journal, heard a third-hand account of the technique. He rode out to the valley, interviewed Briscoe Tate, and wrote a short practical article. He called it the Montana Insulated Wall. Soren Lund's name was never mentioned, but the principles of the still air gap were described perfectly. The idea began to spread. A quiet, practical revolution passed from one builder to another. Soren Lund had not invented a new technology. He had simply reapplied an old and profound principle in a new context. What he built in the Montana wilderness was a perfect, if rustic, example of the insulated cavity wall. This design is the direct and undisputed ancestor of modern high-performance wall construction. Today, every builder uses the same core concept: an exterior sheathing to block the weather, an interior wall surface, and a cavity between them filled with insulation. The modern innovation is to fill that cavity with fiberglass, foam, or cellulose, but the fundamental physics remains identical to what Soren understood in 1888. The goal is to create pockets of trapped, still air. Modern building science has rigorously confirmed the performance of his design. Computer models show that a properly sealed 4-inch air gap, combined with the elimination of thermal bridging and air infiltration, would have resulted in a home that was dramatically more efficient than its contemporaries. His Folly wasn't primitive. It was a century ahead of its time, a brilliant piece of engineering disguised as a simple cabin. The high, cold valleys of the Montana frontier were unforgiving environments. They did not reward credentials, loud opinions, or stubborn adherence to tradition. They rewarded what worked. Briscoe Tate was a master builder, but his mastery was confined to the known world. Soren Lund was an outsider, a craftsman from a different discipline, who saw the problem not as a failure of mass, but as a failure of design. He never sought recognition or validation. He was driven by a simpler, more powerful motive: the quiet, desperate need to keep his family warm. His confidence wasn't arrogance, it was the earned certainty of a man who deeply understood physical principles. The story of Lund's Folly is a powerful reminder that true innovation often looks like madness to those who are most invested in the old way of doing things. It's a testament to the power of interdisciplinary thinking, of applying knowledge from one field to solve a problem in another. And it illustrates how real wisdom spreads in a practical world, not through argument or persuasion, but through the undeniable evidence of a neighbor stepping out of a -32-degree night and into a warm, comfortable home. If this story of quiet genius and earned vindication resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps us continue to bring these forgotten stories to light. Let us know in the comments, what's the most clever old-world solution to a modern problem that you've ever come across? Stay tuned for our next video, where we'll explore how a simple buried pipe system could keep a root cellar cool through the hottest summer months, using nothing but the Earth's constant temperature. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes, presenting historically inspired reconstructions. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, though the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these methods today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and professional consultation. This video does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice,